August 28, 1963. 250,000 Americans, black and white, young and old, descend on the nation's capital in a show of solidarity. It was called the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom, but it would be remembered as a turning point in the fight for civil rights. Among the speakers, the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., who electrified the crowd with his stirring "I Have a Dream" speech.
So even though we face the difficulties of today and tomorrow, I still have a dream.
A few months earlier, racial tensions in the Deep South had erupted. News reports carried brutal images of fire hoses blasting at the backs of school children. The day of the march, more than 200,000 people gathered for a rally at the Washington Monument. It was the largest demonstration in the country's history. Arm in arm, they walked from the Washington Monument to the steps of the Lincoln Memorial. There, performers as diverse as Joan Baez, Bob Dylan, and Mahalia Jackson lent their voices to the cause. Martin Luther King Jr. was the last to take the stage. He began with a reference to Abraham Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation, which freed the slaves a century earlier.
But 100 years later, the Negro still is not free.
Partway through, King put aside his prepared text and shared with the protesters his dream of equal rights for all.
Let freedom ring, and when this happens, when we allow freedom to ring, when we let it ring from every village and every hamlet, from every state and every city, we will be able to speed up that day when all of God's children, black men and white men, Jews and Gentiles, Protestants and Catholics, will be able to join hands and sing in the words of the old Negro spiritual, "Free at last, free at last, thank God Almighty, we are free at last."
What you saw basically sums up the narrative that we were taught in school about the March on Washington in 1963. But I'm going to share a different narrative about that event. Officially held as an iconic event of the civil rights movement, the March on Washington was really organized to prevent a black revolution. Dubbed the Farce on Washington by Malcolm X, the event was organized in collaboration with the Kennedy White House, which was to stop any militant struggle in its tracks as well as to gather votes from the Democratic Party. The main goal of the March on Washington was to get a civil rights bill passed through pressuring President Kennedy. But when Kennedy called in the major black leaders into the Oval Office, it was quickly found out who was calling the shots, and many changes were made to the march. The destination of the march was changed from the White House to the Lincoln Memorial. March leaders deleted a statement to the president and a call to confront Congress from the event's official handbook. Participation was denied to subversive groups and speeches were censored. John Lewis, then the leader of the Militant Student and Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, and today a Georgia congressman, was not allowed to deliver the part of his remarks criticizing the Democrats. Even acclaimed writer James Baldwin was censored. Fearing that he was straight from the script, organizers would not let him read his own speech, which instead was delivered by the actor Burt Lancaster. On November 10, 1963, just weeks after the March on Washington, Malcolm X gave a speech in Detroit called A Message to the Grassroots. It was a response to Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream speech. I highly recommend that you listen to the speech in its entirety. Within that speech, he exposed the politics behind the March on Washington. Let's take a listen.
The Negro Revolt is controlled by the government. The leaders of the Negro Revolt, the so-called Negro civil rights leaders, are subsidized, influenced, and controlled by white liberals in all of the demonstrations that are taking place in this country. For desegregated lunch counters, theaters, public toilets are just artificial fires that have been instigated by white liberals and is being called the Negro Revolt in hope that they can use it to fight off the real black revolution that has already swept through Asia and swept through Africa and is getting started in Latin America and is now manifesting itself here in this country. Can we prove what we say? Can we prove that the Negro Revolt is controlled by white liberals? Yes. Right after the Birmingham explosion, right after the police dogs, the police clubs, and the fire hoses last May, the New York Times on May the 15th, on page 26, reported President Kennedy and his brother Robert Kennedy, two gentlemen whom I'm certain all of you are familiar. After a luncheon with several newspaper editors from the state of Alabama, some of their Democratic colleagues, or I should say Democrat colleagues, the Times reported the president as warning these editors that they must give at least some token gains to the moderate Negro leaders in order to enhance the image of these moderate Negro leaders in the eyesight of the black masses. Otherwise, he warned, the masses of Negroes might turn to the direction of Negro extremists. So he tried to get them to build up the image of the moderate Negro leader, what he called or termed the responsible Negro leader. And whenever you hear a white man refer to a Negro leader as a responsible Negro leader, he means a Negro leader who's responsible to him.
That's right.
He wasn't giving these Negro leaders anything that they deserved, but he was admitting the necessity of building them up and propping them up in order to hold the masses of black people in check, keep them in his grasp and under his control. Dr. Martin Luther King's image had been shattered the previous year when he failed to bring about desegregation in Albany, Georgia. The other Negro civil rights leaders had also become fallen idols. The masses of black people across the country at the local level had begun to lead themselves and to take their cases to the streets on their own. The government in Washington knew that something had to be done to get the Negroes back into the corral, back under the control of the white liberal. The government immediately began to put out the propaganda, encouraging Negroes to follow only what it called responsible Negro leadership.
So like Malcolm was saying, Martin Luther King took some L's in integration campaigns held in Albany, Georgia, and Birmingham. Because of that, black people wanted a real revolution that was stirring in the streets, and the U.S. government needed to put a stop to it, fast.
But the Negro civil rights leaders told the president they couldn't stop it because they didn't start it. They couldn't bring it to a halt. They weren't even leading it. It's spontaneous. It's at the grassroots level. It's in the hands of the masses. It's in the streets. It has no leadership whatsoever. That was why it was so militant. When the president saw that he couldn't stop it, he joined it. He endorsed it. He welcomed it. He became a part of it. And it was he who put the 6 Negro civil rights leaders at the head of it. It was he who made them the Big 6. How did he do it? How did he gain control of the March on Washington? A study of his strategy will give you a glimpse of the political genius of the family that now rules the country from the White House and how they used the Negro to do it. The president endorsed the march. That should have been the tip-off. A few days after he endorsed it, in New York City, at the Carlisle Hotel, a hotel which I think if you investigate you'll find belongs to that illustrious family, a philanthropic society called the Taconic Foundation, headed by a white man, a white liberal named Stephen Curry, called a meeting of the 6 civil rights leaders in an effort to bring about unity of action and unity of purpose among all the civil rights groups. These 6 civil rights groups were shown how they were destroying themselves by divisions and by attacks upon each other.
Here are the Big 6, organizers of the civil rights movement that Malcolm X mentioned. John Lewis, Whitney Young Jr., A. Philip Randolph, Martin Luther King Jr., James Farmer Jr., and Roy Wilkins. There's not much information on the Stephen Currier guy, but what we do know that he was a millionaire liberal and was the president of the Taconic Foundation. Will was at the forefront in organizing support for the civil rights movement and seeking solutions to the urban crisis. There was also another reason why this meeting was called. With national attention on the Birmingham campaign, King became even more valuable as a high-profile fundraiser. Conflict intensified among movement leaders, particularly between King and NAACP chief Roy Wilkins. Historian David Garrow writes, "To a number of close observers, Wilkins' anger and the growing appearance of inter-organizational competition were rooted basically in the heightened financial stakes that had resulted from the Birmingham crisis. That event has elevated King to indisputable civil rights top spot in Americans' public's eye. It also meant that King's SCLC, rather than the long-established NAACP, would be the chief financial beneficiary of the new interest in civil rights. So in 1963, you had this beef going on within the major civil rights organizations. King was hot in the streets and getting to the Jewish money, and Roy Wilkins wasn't feeling it. Stephen Currier was watching this all play out, so he stepped in and basically said, 'Hey fellas, we can all get this money together.'
And it was suggested that since most of their divisions stemmed from their competition for funds from white liberals, they should unite their fundraising efforts. If you check the paper, you'll find that right after the Birmingham explosion, Martin Luther King began to run all over the country participating in fundraising rallies. And Roy Wilkins accused him of starting trouble and expecting the NAACP to get him out and pay the bills while they run all over the country and took all the money. And it caused a lot of friction. So this white liberal, they knew it. And they brought these 6 Negro leaders together and talked to them, told them, don't rock the boat. They formed the Council for United Civil Rights Leadership for fundraising purposes. They chose as chairman of this council the Urban League's Whitney Young and Stephen Currier, the white liberal, as co-chairman. It took this white liberal to bring all the 6 Negro civil rights groups together. It took this white liberal to unite these 6 into one group. And then he let them select their own chairman, but he himself became co-chairman, which placed him and the Taconic Foundation in position to exercise influence and control over the civil rights leaders, and through them, control over the entire civil rights, Negro civil rights movement, plus the March on Washington. According to the New York Times, dated August 4th, 1963, $800,000 was split up between these 6 Negro civil rights organizations on June the 19th. And another $700,000 was promised after the march. Public relations experts were made available to them immediately. They were given access to the news media across the country, and the press immediately began to project the Big 6 as the leaders of the March on Washington.
The Council for United Civil Rights Leadership was an umbrella group formed in June 1963, a couple of months before the March on Washington, to organize and regulate the civil rights movement. The council brought leaders of black civil rights organizations together with wealthy white donors. It successfully arranged the August 1963 March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom with the Kennedy administration. The group stated that the March on Washington would not involve civil disobedience. The Times reported that the group said it was trying to improve control over current racial demonstrations and ensure nonviolence. We want to provide a cadre of experienced Negro leaders who will prevent things from getting out of hand and keep irresponsible elements from turning to violence, said a spokesperson for the council. The organizers rerouted the march so that instead of visiting Capitol Hill to petition Congress, it would travel directly from the Washington Monument at the center of the National Mall to the Lincoln Memorial. Attendees would only be allowed to hold signs displaying one of 5 official statements. They basically hijacked the March on Washington, and some of our favorite black leaders accepted money and allowed it to happen.
As soon as they became looked upon in the public eye as being in control of the march, as being leaders of the march, as being the organizers of the march, and inseparable from the march image, their next step was to invite 4 white liberals to become a part of the Godhead, or group of leaders who would ultimately okay all plans and therefore thereby completely control the march. These 4 white liberals, Walter Reuther, a Jewish rabbi, a priest, and a pastor from Protestants, represented the same factions that had put the president in Washington, D.C. Catholic liberals, Protestant liberals, Jewish liberals, and labor. When the president had learned that he couldn't stop the march, he joined it and got all his friends to join it. This is the way the white liberals took over the March on Washington. This is the way they weakened its impact and changed its course. By changing the participants, by changing the contents, they were able to change the very nature of the march itself.
So a month before the march, the council announced itself on the 2nd of July, 1963, at the meeting with the Leadership Conference on Civil and Human Rights. It told the New York Times that it was seeking $1.5 million in emergency funds. They had already raised $800,000. The funds will be used, said the group, to employ additional field staff to work in areas of greatest tension, to provide additional attorneys to handle the mounting number of court cases arising from mass arrest, and to strengthen the staffing of the 7 organizations. Remember, this is 1963. In less than 3 months, they pulled in $1.5 million. In 2019, that amount would be $12.5 million. These organizations were making bank. These civil rights organizations were mostly owned by wealthy Jewish businessmen using black leaders to be the face of it. Even in 2019, you can apply the strategy to any movement. If you look at the politics in DC, same thing. With money comes influence. You can vote for anyone you want, but it's the ones with the money that has control. Listen to how Malcolm breaks this down.
An example. If I have a cup of coffee that's too strong for me because it's too black, I weaken it by pouring cream into it. I integrate it with cream. If I keep pouring enough cream in the coffee, pretty soon the entire flavor of the coffee is changed. The nature of the coffee is changed. And if enough cream is poured in, eventually you don't even know that I have coffee in my cup. This is what happened with the March on Washington. They didn't integrate it. They infiltrated it. Whites joined it. They engulfed it. They became so much a part of it, it lost its original flavor. It ceased to be a black march. It ceased to be militant. It ceased to be angry. It ceased to be impatient. In fact, it ceased to be a march. It became a farce. It became a picnic, an outing with a festive circus-like atmosphere, with clowns and all. So when these whites join these Negroes and they're demonstrating, there's 2 different motives. The Negroes are demonstrating for freedom, but the whites are out there demonstrating to keep the Negroes from getting too far out of line. The government found out that this is the only way black people could be held in check. The government told the marchers on Washington what time to arrive in Washington, where to arrive, and when to arrive. Then the government channeled them from the arrival point to the feet of a dead president named Washington, and let them march from there to the feet of another dead president named Lincoln.
Here are the organizations involved with the Council for United Civil Rights Leadership: the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, the NAACP Legal Defense and Educational Fund, the National Urban League, the National Council of Negro Women, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, the Congress of Racial Equality.
The original black militants had planned to march on the White House, on the Senate, on the Congress, but the shrewd politicians in Washington, D.C., realizing that these black militants could not be stopped, joined them, and thereby these white liberals were able to lead them away from the White House, away from the Capitol, away from the Senate, and away from the Congress, and away from victory, by keeping them marching between the Washington Monument and the Lincoln Monument, marching between the feet of two dead men. The march was controlled by the president. The government told the marchers what signs to carry, what songs to sing, what speeches they could make and what speeches they could not make. And then the government told them to be sure and get out of town by sundown. And all those Negro Uncle Toms were out of town by sundown. One of the 6 Negro leaders, John Lewis, chairman of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, was stopped from making a militant speech. The speech was censored by the Reverend Patrick O'Boyle, the Catholic Archbishop of Washington, D.C. Catholic clergyman doesn't speak on his own. He doesn't have that latitude. When he opens up his mouth, that's the church speaking. This was a case in which the Catholic Church itself, for whom Reverend O'Boyle speaks, put itself in a position of censoring one of the 6 Negro civil rights leaders. This shows John F. Kennedy's shrewd strategy. In fact, that's what that F stands for, the fox. This Catholic president placed the Catholic bishop in a position to exercise censorship over any one of the 6 Negro civil rights leaders who tried to deviate from the script in that great performance or show that the government itself had controlled from the very beginning. So in the final analysis of the march, it would have to be classified as the best performance of the year. In fact, the best performance of the century. It topped anything that Hollywood could have produced. And if we were going to give out Academy Awards in 1963, we would have to nominate John the Fox for an Oscar for the producer of the year. And to the 4 white liberals also goes an Oscar for the best actors. They really acted like sincere liberals and fooled many Negroes. And to the 6 Negro civil rights leaders also should go an Oscar for the best supporting cast. They lent their support to what they knew was nothing but an act, nothing but a show, nothing but a farce. Now that the show is over, the black masses are still without jobs, still without homes, and still without land. Their Christian churches are being bombed. Their little girls are being murdered. What did the march accomplish? The president has a bigger image as a liberal. The 4 whites have a bigger image as a liberal. The 6 Negroes have bigger images as leaders. But the black masses are still unemployed, still in the slums, are still hungry. And I might add, they're getting angrier and more explosive every day.
Now this is a true story about the March on Washington. Please like, subscribe, hit the bell for notifications, leave comments, let me know what you think, and thank you for watching.